Hello, it's Saturday's newscast. We're reunited because you've been at the conference season.
I have, and how nice to be back with you. And we're even matching today.
We're not matching in terms of life experience, but we are we are fashion-wise. It's a very, very busy news cycle and weekend, and so we're absolutely over the moon to have Jeremy Bowen, who's in Jerusalem, with us. Hello.
Yeah, hello.
And Jeremy, you're in your hotel room in front of Pelly cases where we keep all our news equipment. You must have a strange feeling about sort of being poised for the big moment when there's already been momentous days. What's the atmosphere like there?
Yeah, well, a Paddy case. Actually, I keep my flak jacket stuff in, but because we're not allowed into Gaza by order of the Israelis, I haven't needed it. It's been in there since actually before my last visit because I didn't need it then either for the same reason. But in general, of course, it's been very busy here, non-stop for, well, I think mentally non-stop for Palestinians and Israelis who are watching what's happening. And, for us journalists, a lot of non-stop reporting as well. So this is a bit of an in-between day today. We're talking on Saturday, and after the alarms and excursions of the last few days with those great lines of people going back to Gaza City, of course, that's continuing today. I noticed that the Egyptians they sent in trucks and offering free transport back there because people were walking or having to pay apparently £900 for a car ride. So it was a ridiculous amount of money for people who've got nothing. But so, yeah, I say this is a bit in between because in the next couple of days, what's happening, Sunday, Monday, are Israeli hostages coming back, Palestinian prisoners being released, and then, of course, Donald Trump arriving and making a speech to the Israeli parliament, the Knesset.
So on this in-between day, we can look ahead and also we can take stock of the incredible developments in the last couple of days on this Saturday's newscast.
Hello, it's Paddy in the studio.
And it's Laura in the studio. And
I'm here, Jeremy, in Jerusalem, in my hotel room.
And a little bit later, I've also got what to people who really, really care about these things is a very interesting development in the Labour deputy leadership race. I will not for a single second pretend that that is of anything like the import of what we're seeing, potentially a war ending in the way that we all saw this terrible war begin, which is one of the things that's been big playing on my mind. We're seeing, as Jeremy was just telling us, people walking home to find sometimes that their homes have been destroyed. But anyway, more on that Labour leadership, little bit of intel a bit later on.
Jeremy, let's ask you as a visual image of a war changing, pausing, to see civilians with nothing walking home to damaged, destroyed homes. That's how we recall Europe in 1945.
Yeah, it's on a massive scale in a small area. I mean, Gaza itself, the Gaza Strip, if you just look at square mileage, it's, I think, a bit smaller than the Isle of Wight. But more than 2 million people, an enormous amount of destruction, and 55% of it still occupied by the Israeli military, the IDF.
So we've heard on the Broadcasting House research desk this afternoon that there's a vigil tonight in Tel Aviv of hostage families, Israeli families, who hope this will be the last such vigil tonight. Then you've got the sight of 500,000 Gazans on the move today. That's the estimated numbers that we've been seeing. Jeremy, what happens next if it is according to plan? You've told us that the US president comes in as well. What time's he due?
Well, he's due on Monday, and he's making a speech, I think sort of around lunchtime, something like that. He's only going to be here a few hours because he's then moving on to Egypt, to Sharm el-Sheikh, where they did the deal. And he might well be signing something there. There's talk of some kind of a mini summit, but, he's actually in the Middle East. He's flying all the way over from Washington, D.C., or from the airbase just outside it. And he will be on the ground here for, not even all the hours of daylight. By dusk, he'll be flying back. It is the definition of a flying visit.
But it's interesting because clearly, as Trump has been given credit for this different kind of more brutal brutish diplomacy, perhaps, but that has been seen to have an effect where, I've been thinking a lot before he moves into the White House, people were saying all sorts of terrible things. It could be disaster, all kinds of, and maybe it has been in some ways, and people can dispute that. But at this moment in time, President Trump is being given huge diplomatic credit for this. But this flying visit into Israel tells us that he also wants to be seen to be part of it, not, oh, I made this big achievement, let's now let the region get on with it. But actually, clearly, he wants to have his stamp, his face, his authority, and his role in this all over it before going to that signing summit, where I think we might actually see some European leaders, and maybe even the British Prime Minister might attend that too. Really? On Monday in Egypt, possibly.
Jeremy, this deal is not popular. I mean, the outcome is popular, but the business of releasing people who have been convicted of murder in Israeli jails, for instance, there will be people in the Knesset who do not want them released, and they're going to be released. So what kind of reception will the US president get when he's in Israel?
I think you're going to hear his reception, and that's good reason why he's coming. There are people who are unhappy in Israel, but including some of the families of people who some of these Palestinian individuals killed, and some of them have been in prison since the mid-1990s. But, it's the price Israel is paying, and it's always been like this over the years. There have been many prisoner exchanges of this nature. And one of the actual warnings that some Israelis are concerned about is that Yahya Sinwar, who was the main architect of the attacks on the 7th of October 2023, he was released in an earlier prisoner exchange in 2011. He had served 22 years in an Israeli prison for killing some Israelis and also Palestinians who he said were collaborators working with the Israelis. That was one of his jobs. He went around going after people like that. So he was someone who got released in 2011 and then went back into, if you like, active duties with Hamas, moved up through the firmament until he was the top man in Gaza, and he planned those attacks. So people are saying, look, these are dangerous. And that's one of the reasons, I think, why, not the only reason, but one of the reasons why the best known names on the list that Hamas put forward are not being released by the Israelis, because they include people who took part in for example, in the second Palestinian uprising that started in 2000. There are some people there, some men there who were sentenced to prison long terms for some of the most notorious bomb attacks. And there's also one other who is not a Hamas member or leader. In fact, he is from Fatah, the other side of Palestinian politics, if you like, the people who run the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, and that is Marwan Barghouti, who is he was sentenced to, I think it's 5 life sentences plus a period of years for organizing attacks on Israelis in the second deadly attacks that killed people in the second Intifada. And he is, though, seen not as a military figure, he's seen as a political figure by Palestinians, not by Israelis, who most of whom would, or many of whom would regard him as a terrorist. But he's often referred to as the Palestinian Nelson Mandela. Nelson Mandela, the South African leader, was sentenced to a long life sentence for sabotage in the Rivonia trials in South Africa in, I think it was 63, something like that. He served 27 years in jail. Then he was released, and we know what happened after that. The end of apartheid, he became not just president, but an absolutely revered man around the world. So Barghouti, however, despite great popularity, and some people argue that actually if you want to have a political process with a credible Palestinian leader, he would be maybe the best interlocutor. He's in his early 60s, mid 60s now, and he's someone who could, a lot of people argue, not just Palestinians, but people who are interested in developing a political process would argue that he would be a far better man to deal with than the almost 90-year-old President Mahmoud Abbas, who, well, frankly, doesn't do a great deal at all, at least not publicly.
There are so many different complexities then to this, aren't there? And also so much jeopardy around that prisoner release. But Jeremy, there have been reports this afternoon that Hamas have been mobilizing in some way. What do we know? And is that anything that could put, a spanner in the works here?
Well, this is because, yeah, they have been mobilizing, and our esteemed Gaza correspondent, Rushdie Abu-Aluf, was the first person to be reporting this. It was quite I think, great piece of journalism he did today about that. And essentially what's happening is, yes, Hamas have mobilized some units, put out announcements for people to report in. And that's because there are powerful clans inside Gaza who've always been rivals to them. There's one particularly, which is based around an extended family called the Dogmush clan. And these were the people who were responsible for the kidnapping of the BBC correspondent, Alan Johnson. At that time, I went to Damascus to speak to the then leader of Hamas, Khaled Mashal, to ask him to try and intervene to see what they could do. And in the end, Hamas and pressure inside Gaza extricated, other kinds of pressure too, extricated Alan from that situation. But the Dogmush clan are well armed, and they're not the only ones. And they have, a strong agenda of their own. And one of their agendas, I think, is to take advantage of the security vacuum that's there. And that's why Hamas are moving to try to stop that happening, because clearly Hamas see themselves as part of the future of Gaza and of the Palestinian people in a way that the Israelis are horrified by the thought of.
And other Western leaders and UK leaders would say, actually, Hamas must not be part of the future governance of Gaza. So at this point, and I appreciate not just on the streets, this fight may take place inside Gaza over who's going to be in control, but also among the international community. There's going to be big arguments about who should take control. As things stand at this point, what's your best guess of who will end up actually running Gaza as long as the war does come to an end, as everybody hopes it will?
I'm not going to guess because I don't know, frankly. But what I'm going to tell you is why they're in this mess. And that's because it's the nature of the deal. The Trump 20-point plan had one part of it that actually was thought out in a detailed way. And that's the bit that after over 3 days they negotiated in Sharm el-Sheikh, which is what's happening over the weekend and on maybe into Monday, which is the release of the Israeli hostages and then the Palestinian prisoners. But the rest of it, the 20-point plan, the other points which to do with things like governance, the economy, future security and governance is probably the most important thing.
Disarmament.
Yeah, that's part of security, I suppose, and also the bringing in of aid. Now, it points out the aspirations. It's a signpost to where they want to be, but it doesn't, with any sort of precision, say how they're going to get there. And all that has been left deliberately vague. Now, I've been speaking to various senior diplomats about, who are involved in complex negotiations, and what they say to me is they said, look, one of them said, when you're doing a deal between two terrible enemies, actually ambiguity is your friend, because if you come out with a fairly, as the Trump plan is, it's quite vague in places. It absolutely lacks a great deal of detail. It's definitely ambiguous, and you could argue in parts it's even contradictory. But that meant and means that the different parties can project onto it the interpretation that they want. But the diplomat went on to tell me, he said, the problem is that when you actually get to the implementation phase, ambiguity stops being your friend, it becomes your enemy. Because to make these things work, you need firm foundations, you need agreements, you need detail, you need timetables, you need maps, you need footnotes and appendices and all kinds of things like that. And you need also a very good supervision. And apparatus set for a ceasefire. Ceasefires always break down at different times. There are always violations. The trick is trying to keep them going. Now, the Americans are sending in people to do this, so they're not going to be in Gaza themselves, but they're only just arriving today, I think. They're just unpacking their suitcases. So, I mean, they're very efficient. Their logistics are amazing. They'll do a lot. But you know, it's very, very rushed. It's very, very last minute. It was the only way they could do it, I suppose. So what I'm saying is that because there is all this space in the agreement, people through their actions are trying to, Hamas particularly at the moment, are trying to, you know, create some facts on the ground. As for disarmament of Hamas, demilitarization of Gaza, the Trump plan says that it should take place through an agreed process. There should be an agreed process of decommissioning. The problem is there is no agreed process. No one has even talked about what the process might be in any public detail anyway. And Netanyahu did a speech yesterday where he said Hamas have got to give up their weapons and they can do it the easy way, which he means just give them up, put them down, or they can do it the hard way, which he was, I suppose, hinting means that the IDF would go back and do it for them and therefore the war would start again. So you know, there are many, many open questions.
Just briefly, Jeremy, because we've taken lots of your time and we know how much you've got to do in these next really important days. We've had a question from Anne, one of our newscasters, who wants to know when will the BBC and other journalists be allowed back into Gaza to start reporting freely on the ground? When do you think that might happen?
Well, it was up to us tomorrow morning, but it's up to the Israelis. And well, so I really don't know. I mean, they've taken the flak for not letting us in for 2 years of war. It's not going to hurt them very much to get a bit more flak about blocking us. And I suspect that, I could be wrong on this, I hope I'm wrong, I suspect that while Israel retains exclusive control of entry and access into Gaza, I would be very surprised if it happened. They take people in occasionally on what they call embeds, where you go in a very supervised trip with the Israeli army, generally when the Israelis want to make a propaganda point. So yeah, allowing people, thankfully, there are Palestinian journalists in there who've been doing a great job at great danger, well over 200 of them killed.
Well, we all hope that you are able to go in and bring us your own excellent reporting from in there as soon as possible. But as you rightly point out, and everybody is grateful for the very courageous work of Palestinian journalists who have been doing it throughout this terrible conflict. Jeremy, we will speak to you on the TV tomorrow morning. I think we'll also be on Broadcasting House. Did you say that, Paddy? So we're all going to have lots more of these conversations very, very soon. Excellent.
I'll be talking to both of you later, tomorrow.
Well, I feel like we've already done our research for that conversation now.
Jeremy will judge what the research was like. But we're waiting for all the overnight developments, and you'll be our eyes and ears as usual. Thank you so much. Our international editor, Jeremy Bowen.
Thank you.
Now then, Patrick, to matters that seem, compared to all of that, like not very small beer. However, they are big beer in UK political circles because it's politics, so there's always a contest going on somewhere. And at the moment, there's a contest going on in the Labour Party.
Yes, and it's peculiar for a governing Labour Party as opposed to an opposition party because the deputy leader, we've already got a deputy prime minister.
Yes, we do, David Lammy.
And that changed, didn't it? Because Angela Rayner was the deputy prime minister. And I wonder what happened to her. Anyway,
Answers on a postcard.
Yeah. So we had her, then she left, then we've got David Lammy. So why do they need a deputy leader?
Well, that's a question some people wonder out loud because as someone said to me, it's a bit of a funny, vague job. You know, they technically have lots of responsibilities. They have a place on the National Executive Committee, which is a pretty obscure group, but very, very important. It's like Labour's decision-making body as a party. They're able to attend what's called political cabinet. So not the Tuesday cabinet every week when ministers gather. It's an event that happens much less regularly than that. But essentially, the civil servants get chucked out of the room so the ministers can talk about politics. And the deputy leader would be able to go along to that, even if they're not in government. And they sit on various other committees in Parliament. And of course, they have a big campaigning role at Labour Party HQ. So it is a bit of a weird job. And if you think about it over time, from conversations I've had in the last couple of days and just observing it over the years, actually that role is kind of defined more by the character of the person who has it and the relationship they've got with the boss. So there's a sort of supportive, helpful political pal in the way that John Prescott was to Tony Blair. You know, he wasn't disloyal, but he spoke in pretty blunt terms and was able to appeal to parts of the Labour Party that the kind of, more schmoozy elements of Tony Blair's circle was not. Or sometimes it can be a real battle of wills. So if you think of Jeremy Corbyn and Tom Watson, so Tom Watson was, it's fair to say, not a Corbynista. And he was sort of trying to represent the interests of lots and lots of Labour MPs and Labour members, those of whom were unhappy about Jeremy Corbyn's direction of travel. So it can be very, very different depending on the characters.
And we've got the vote coming soon. And you promised at the top of a newscast a scoopette.
I did. So the two candidates this time, and we should mention them, are Lucy Powell, who was recently booted out of the cabinet. She was leader of the House, and Bridget Phillipson, who's also the Education Secretary. Now, at the moment, Lucy Powell appears to be the definite favourite. Someone in the cabinet even said to me, like, everyone knows that Lucy's going to get it. Actually, we don't know that because the ballots are in people's inboxes and all the votes haven't been cast yet. However, Bridget Phillipson, perhaps because she's conscious that she's behind, is going to promise members, and I think we'll hear more about this from her on the show tomorrow, that they'll have more power over policy. So she's going to say that she would, once every 3 months, she'd have a sort of formal consultation with members where they can put ideas forward. They can tell her what they want the government to do. They can tell her what they want secretaries of state to do. She's also promising that frontbenchers would have to have meetings with members. So, the health secretary or whoever would have to have a kind of little online chat where Labour Party members can directly tell them what they think of what they're up to. And also she wants to change one of Labour's quite obscure but important rules, which is she'd say she would stop outside organisations contributing ideas to Labour's kind of policy-making machine. Because at the moment, companies, charities, lobbyists, whoever, can all submit ideas into the Labour Party. And she's going to say, no, members must be treated as more important. So the rest of you, out.
So it's a kind of effort to influence the voting by giving her new ideas to the members.
I think she's trying to appeal to members because she's been behind in the race. Because I think ultimately, politically, there's not that much difference between Bridget Phillipson and Lucy Powell. Lucy Powell is not some kind of wild, crazy rebel. She was in the cabinet till a few weeks ago. Bridget Phillipson is also not the way that she's been represented as some kind of robot who just does what Keir Starmer tells her. Shock horror, as I wrote online today. Shock horror in a political campaign, there are caricatures knocking around, that either both women are somehow the stooges for male politicians, Andy Burnham and Keir Starmer. Well, they're not, nor are they the caricatures that have been presented of themselves. But the main sort of fault line really between them is that Bridget Phillipson is in the government.
Yeah.
And essentially she'd say, well, I'd be a critical friend, but behind closed doors, I'm trying to help the leader. Lucy Powell is sort of saying, no, look, members want us to do things a bit differently, and I would be willing to speak my mind. But in a funny way, there's been so much enormous news around in the last month or so since this vote has been ongoing. It hasn't really caught light as a political race, I think partly because there aren't that many differences between the two of them politically. This is not a Diane Abbott versus Peter Kyle, if we think the sort of right of the Labour Party and the left of the Labour Party. And partly because there isn't that much policy difference between the two of them. And, they're both well-liked women from different parts of the north of England. They're not like vastly, vastly different. Because of that, I think a lot of MPs and Labour Party members are essentially going to use this actually as a bit of a litmus test for how they feel about Keir Starmer and the leadership.
It was interesting because these contests, and we're at the end now, and it's me just digging around for one anecdote, which I think is memorable from the Conservative leadership race, which Liz Truss won.
She did.
And Rishi Sunak in the debates his face looked horrified at her financial plan. Mm-hmm. He said to her, it's going to put up interest rates, Liz. And we actually haven't had that sort of red-on-red debate between these two candidates.
No, we haven't.
We had blue-on-blue.
That's true. And there have been a few kind of spats, but they've been pretty minor. So, last week we spoke to Lucy Powell and Bridget Phillipson had accused her of that she would be a divisive candidate. And Lucy Powell said, well, that's a ridiculous claim. But, it's all been, relatively speaking, quite sedate. There have been, and there are some kind of nasty briefings doing the rounds. But in a kind of, well, it was suggested to me that, well, Lucy Powell would be sidelined and nobody would really listen to her anyway. And then I was told that Lucy Powell had refused to do public hustings on the telly. And then the Powell camp told me that, no, that was a whole load of nonsense. So, you know, so there is a bit of a kind of squabble going on. But is this contest a mighty fight for the soul of the Labour Party? No, it is not.
Right.
However, if Bridget Phillipson is second, which it looks like she's going to be, it is another one of their moments when Keir Starmer's pick or Keir Starmer's decision will be rejected by people in his party, because she is the choice that the leadership would prefer to have Bridget Phillipson in that job.
So,
And someone said to me, you know, if Lucy wins, essentially the party will be deciding that the person who Keir decided a few weeks ago wasn't good enough to be in the cabinet should actually be promoted to be his number two. They said it'd be more evidence of his reverse Midas touch.
the
Ouch!
reverse Midas touch. Right. Well, there's a phrase with which to end. And
Reverse Midas touch, yes. We had a reverse Burnham last week, didn't we?
we had a reverse Burnham. We did have a reverse Burnham. So we listened. Somewhere we say, with the time that's left, a big thanks to newscasters. This is such an amazing time in the news, and we know that people are listening, hoping for revelations and analysis. And I was so lucky to hear from Jeremy, and we'll be trying our best on Sunday's newscast to bring the developments that have changed since we're closing today's.
We will. And I was also going to say that I hope newscasters have been grateful to have quadruple denim, not just double denim, quadruple denim. Quite a thing, never before seen anywhere. Mercifully may never be seen again.
Words I never thought I'd hear as I woke up this morning. Thank you very much for listening and watching, and goodbye.
Goodbye. We'll be back tomorrow.